Hello, my name is Charlene Lee, and thank you so much for joining me today. I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, something I'm very passionate about, which is how do you do disruption, but also create a strong sense of belonging. And that oftentimes comes from making sure that people feel included. They feel that they are amongst people who they can trust, because it's really hard to be disruptive if you're not feeling like you're feeling safe. And I find that this is so important, especially now there's a huge amount of dialogue around racial and social injustice and equity and equality. And I want to dig down a little bit deeper into how this impacts disruption. One of the things I've studied over time is what does it take to be a disruptive leader? And what I have found in my research is that if you are the only person in the room, if you are the only woman, if you are the only person of color, I worked overseas for a while. I was the only non-European in the room, and as a woman, as a person of color. And no matter what that only is, it could be the oldest person in the room. You could be the youngest person in the room. If you feel like you are using all of your energy just to fit in, the last thing you're going to do is to raise your hand and say, I disagree, or raise your hand and say, I think we should go in a completely different direction, or raise your hand and say, why don't we think about this in a different way? And this is so important because you don't have to be only in any sort of physical sense, any visible sense, to feel like you don't belong. If you just don't feel like you're included and you belong, you're not going to raise your hand and disrupt. And I just wanted to throw up some of the reasons why this is so important, because my research with leaders is that when you are trying to be a leader, there are two major aspects of being a disruptive leader. You have to have an openness to change mindset, which is this one column. And then the other column is to have leadership behaviors and experiences and skills to be able to empower and inspire other people. So this is the research that I had from my latest book, The Disruption Mindset. And you find that when I talk to these leaders, I also asked them, like, this is how do you actually do this? How do you create that sense of belonging and safety inside a space? And so as I get into the space and talk about how you actually do this, how the research, what it's seen, I would love for you to share where you're coming from. I see some people are chiming in already, saying hello. So thank you so much for joining. Please say where you're coming from and share an experience where you didn't feel like you belonged. I think we all have been in those places where it just felt like awkward, you're sitting back. And then if you can, just share, how did you overcome that? Did somebody step in? What changed in that environment that allowed you to feel like you belonged and therefore were included and could raise your hand and be that disruptor? Because my strong belief is we need as leaders is to create as much as possible an environment where we feel like everyone is included. They can bring their best selves. And the reason why I think this is such an important end goal is that oftentimes we think about diversity and equity and inclusion, these DEI initiatives, primarily on the diversity side, which is where we're counting the numbers of, do we have the numbers of people who are representative, who are diverse? And that's really important. But just as important, are we feeling about the equity? Are we giving people chances to be able to perform at their best level? And more importantly, do people feel like they are included? And especially the belonging side of things. Belonging says, not only am I included, but I feel I am one of the tribe. And it's only when that happens, when you've created that kind of environment, when you remove the fact that you're the only in the room and it doesn't matter anymore. We still see that contribution that you have, that unique thing that you can bring, but you truly feel like you are a member of that team. So what I wanted to get into, first of all, was to share one piece of data and information. Let me just get my numbers here set up, is why is belonging so important? This is some interesting data that I found from the NCIR and Russell Reynolds. And some of the research that they found was that when people feel like they belong, this is what happens. 74% feel that they're bringing their full potential about their creative selves. 72% say they're going to stay longer in the organization because, like, why would I leave? Because I feel like I belong. And 90% of people say they're engaged. And just the opposite, if you don't feel like you belong, you can see the numbers here in red. It is significantly different. So how do you actually create belonging then? Because it's one thing to say it's important for us to feel like we're belonging, but the actual act of belonging, how do we create that kind of environment is much more difficult. So I just want to take a moment and pause and recognize some of the people joining from all over the place. We have people coming in from Oregon and Florida. Allison, thanks for joining. Armando, Elizabeth, great to see you here. Maria, we also have people coming in from, let's see, Mexico and Nigeria. This is fantastic. It's so different and diverse, the group of people we have coming from all over the place. And we also have somebody coming from Paris too. So, and again, I think that the reality is that we are facing this need for us to be able to connect with people, to be able to encourage people with vastly different backgrounds to be able to connect, to feel included, and then to belong. So I want to go on to the next area, which is how do we actually think about the definition of belonging? And I do like this particular little framework, which I found also from the same group. And it is this inclusion index model. And so this is something developed by Russell Reynolds. And I love it because it talks about the many different ways that you can create belonging. There's the overall environment you see in green here. It's working across differences, being able to have difficult conversations, leveraging different perspectives, workplace respect, and voice and influence. And that comes from people creating and actively seeking this out. So as a team, as an organization, as a leader, are you fostering and encouraging a sense of openness that people are free to speak up and talk about their differences? Do you sit back as a leader and entertain and ask for, almost demand that people speak up and disagree and feel safe that we can disagree? And that comes not overnight, just from just asking a few questions. You have to build that level of trust. And it really requires that you develop that relationship with people individually and also with each other so that there is this sense of tribe and belonging and inclusion. But I also like in here are some of the aspects around leadership and structure. There are things you can do structurally around this to make sure that you're at least trying to make this approach take on a greater role rather than just individuals. There's leadership commitment and organizational fairness. People feel like people are being honest and, most importantly, fair. People feel like, okay, I've got a shot here at being included. And then there are things that you can do structurally, which is to say, from an equity point of view, we know that things aren't a balanced playing field. So if you have a difference, it could be physical, it could be in your background, education, we're going to make accommodations for that. Do you have to work from home, which is many of the cases that we have today? How are we going to accommodate for that? And then finally, in terms of recruitment, retention, these are all the things that so many HR professionals are working with today, is how do we structurally, and from a recruiting basis, from a promotion basis, make sure that we're doing this. So I would love to hear from people again, just how do you think about belonging? How do you create an environment where you feel like the people you're working with, your team members, if you're a leader, how do you actually foster this sense that they are being heard, they're being seen, and more importantly, they're being valued and part of that team? Because if you are intent on driving exponential growth, driving disruption as a disruption leader, then you're going to have to be very intent on making sure that this happens. So a couple last things here that I wanted to just talk a little bit about is how do you actually do this? First of all, I do think that tying any of your diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I include in here again, belonging efforts, tie it very, very clearly to your growth initiatives, to your disruption initiatives. because the studies have shown over and over and over again that when you have a diverse group of people and they feel like they are included, you will come up with better answers. You will come up with better solutions more efficiently, faster than your competition. And the answers and the results you get will be so much robust. Because what we found in the disruption studies is that it is not about getting the perfect answer. It's about getting to that answer as quickly as possible. Because the sooner you can test and learn inside your organization before you take it out to the external world, the better and faster you'll be able to move. And disruption is always about how fast can you move to catch up to your customers who are already moving so much further than you. I love this quote from Molly. Thank you so much for sharing this quote from Hillary Hatley. Diversity is about being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. And belonging is getting on the dance floor and acting like a fool and knowing we've got your back. Thank you so much, Molly, for sharing that, because I think that is such a great way to think about it. It's not enough to just get the numbers in. It's not enough just to be inviting people in. And so this leads to my second point, which is, so if your first thing is to link all of these efforts to your growth initiatives and to really say, if we're going to grow, if we're going to be successful at disrupting and creating growth, then we're going to have to make sure we create a culture of belonging and inclusion that's also very diverse. The second thing, though, is that you have to measure this. You can't just say, okay, we've got the numbers in place. How do you actually measure that the growth is there? So I love this index, again, this inclusion index for the measurement, because you can go through each of these areas and understand how that works. But you can also, I think, is to be able to think about measurements like leadership indexes, which is to say, again, this is a bit of counting, but it also says that you've created an environment when you have 20% of a population that may be, for example, women of color. And if that group coming into the organization, you've done a good job recruiting them, then are they being promoted? Are you promoting them to the next level, to the manager level, also at 20%, to the director level at 20%, to the VP and to the executive C-suite level at 20%? Because this is one of the best indicators that say that if you are truly including people, if you have great equity programs, if you're fostering the sense of belonging, then you will see that diversity that you've worked so hard to get people in are also increasing up. Because you don't get to advance in an organization unless you have confidence in that person, unless that person is putting out that extra effort because they feel like they are belonging. So I think that the second part is to make sure you're looking at that index of leadership promotion, but also be surveying for belonging. Do people feel like they belong? And this is, I think, so important, because when I think about how do you actually survey people, how do you actually go through and figure out where do people fit? How do they actually feel about whether they belong or not? And I go back to, again, this chart here. And understand, do people feel like, for example, they have a voice? Do they have influence? Do we feel like we're leveraging their different perspectives? Or just simply asking, do you feel like you belong on a scale of 1 to 10? And if they're not like 8, 9s, and 10s, then there's work to be done there. So the last area that I think is important to think about for creating belonging is something I've been very passionate about. It's this whole sense of being open. Because when you are open, that means that you are actually allowing this sense of openness for people to chime in, to be able to raise their hands. And as the Hillary Hatley quote from Molly says, I feel like I can be a total fool on that dance floor and it's going to be okay because people have my back. And so this is where openness, transparency that leads to accountability is so important. And one of the questions I got about 10 years ago was the question, how open do I need to be? How open do we need to be as an organization? How open do I need to be as a leader in order to be successful? And after doing a lot of research, I wrote this book called Open Leadership. And the answer is pretty simple, is you need to be as open as is needed to create that trust with your with your employees, with your team members, with your colleagues. Be as open as needed to be able to create trust with your customers. And so the big depends part, it depends, is actually pretty measurable because you can actually understand and see if trust is happening with this simple question. Is that when push comes to shove, when in your times of crisis or of innovation, does every single member of your team feel like they can raise their hand and say, I've got an idea. I want to disagree. I want to challenge that. Do they feel safe enough and they feel tight enough and belonging to this team enough that they feel comfortable raising their hand? And especially so if they are of one particular group that may not feel that way. What we found in the Disruption Mindset, my latest book, is that women across the board rated themselves at a whole step lower in terms of their disruption capabilities than their male counterparts, even though their capabilities around openness to change mindset and leadership behaviors were at the exact same level as their male counterparts. But women, for whatever reason, have stepped back, have taken themselves out of that game in some ways, because for whatever reason, we have been acclimatized to thinking, no, we can't raise our hands and be disruptive. There's so many reasons behind that. And so whatever the reason is, because if you're a woman, a person of color, the only, we as leaders, it's incumbent on us to create an environment, be open, and to seek out these people and reinforce to them, you have every right to bring your full self to the table. And I will be here. I will be here to support you, to form that foundation so that you can push off and jump really high in the air and leap for that disruption. So I want to just say thank you again for joining me. I hope this discussion is helpful. And I think my last point here is to take a minute to really sit back in your leadership growth areas and say, how are you creating a space? How are you creating a place so that every single person that you are working with can feel like they belong? Not just included, but truly, truly belong. I wish you all the best with that. And again, thank you so much for joining this broadcast. Have a great day.